This time we're going to talk about what Mr. Nelson has been saying, that apes and humans are related. Now, you know your ancestors better than me. I've never been to a family reunion of yours. However, my ancestors were not apes. None of them swung by their tails. Some might have swung by their necks, but none swung by their tails, okay? So in his closing arguments, he said that apes are related to humans. Now, Mr. Nelson, I told you it may take me a while because you are low priority, but
I'll be back.
And I'll keep coming back till we get it nailed. You said, point number 10, and this may take a little while, the different cladistic categories or taxonomic classifications of life that prove that humans are apes and that birds are dinosaurs are determined objectively according to a suite of morphological, embryological, and molecular data without anyone having to draw lines on paper. We covered some of that last night. We're going to take just the part I skipped. Probably shouldn't have skipped it, but the chart showing that humans are apes. No, we're not apes, Mr. Nelson. I'm sorry. We're not.
Even him.
Hmm?
Even him.
Even you are not. You sure? Okay. I had to think about that twice. You can pontificate all you want, stand on your soapbox and say, humans are apes, and that's what you do, I'm sure, and you probably really believe it. I don't question that. Most dictators and maniacs are good at forcefully, dogmatically, and even threateningly saying things until their disciples are afraid to question them. And that's what you're doing about this humans and apes. You talked about cladistics. It's not just a bunch of lines on paper. Yes, it is. They say, well, we've got evidence for those lines. You could draw lines all sorts of different ways and claim evidence, like I covered last night. But you're bamboozling people, and I want to talk about that here real quick. You are hoodwinking, bamboozling people. You said humans are apes. I'm sorry. No, that's not true. Right here. The charts evolutionists make are claiming relationships. They're pure imagination and are simply lines on paper. Humans are not apes. The hands are very different between humans and apes. Chimps versus humans. Are we different? Duh. But you can't see we're different. Well, let's look at some of the differences. How about the strength? We had a pet chimpanzee when I was growing up. No, a squirrel monkey. Henry the spider monkey. Henry the spider monkey. My brother had it as a pet. That thing was incredible. And the strength was phenomenal. If you held something close to the cage that it wanted, it would reach out and grab it and pull. And you couldn't get it away, and the thing was only this tall. According to Hunt, if you shave a chimp and take a photo of its body from the neck to the waist, at first glance, you wouldn't really notice it isn't human. The two species, musculature is extremely similar, but somehow, pound for pound, chimps are between 2 and 3 times stronger than humans. They are incredibly strong, pound for pound. Let's see, why are chimpanzees stronger than humans? Chimps are far stronger than we are, but why? And there's plenty on the internet about this topic. They don't look any different. The muscles don't look a lot bigger. The muscles are attached differently in quite a few cases, especially those for walking, etc., and holding their posture up, straight up and down. But they are just incredibly strong. So, Mr. Nelson, the muscle position and strength shows clearly we are not apes. You could work out every day, all day long, and not be as strong as an ape, the same size and same body weight. Conversation. You know, monkeys don't have conversation like we do. They cannot infer the mental state of another individual, whether they are happy or sad. This one atheist said, I believe that a theory of mind was the big breakthrough by our ancestors. One of the ape ancestors just decided to start thinking and wondering, what are other people thinking? Monkeys don't do that. Their brain is different. Why can't apes speak? Unlike humans, apes lack anatomical prerequisites for verbal language production. Fancy way of saying they don't have the hardware to speak. The organs within the vocal tract, such as larynx, muscles, and vocal cords, cannot be moved as freely and coordinated as in humans, especially not at a comparable speed. So they can't talk like we do. Will chimpanzees ever be able to speak? For decades, monkeys and apes' vocal anatomy has been blamed for their inability to produce human speech sounds. But a new study suggests macaque monkeys, and by extension other primates, could indeed talk if they only possess the brain. So not only do they not have the vocal wiring to do it, they don't have the brain to do it, the part of the brain that's missing that allows them to speak and recognize and understand verbal communication. So, Mr. Nelson, I'm sorry, humans are not apes. They have nothing similar to speech like we do. How about their stance, the way they stand? Humans are bipedal. Apes And except for short bouts of uprightness, great apes walk on all fours. It's a profound disparity. Kevin Hunt, director of Human Origins and Primate Evolution Lab at Indiana University, thinks humans' ancestors stood upright in order to reach vegetation in low-hanging tree branches. Oh, so they learned to go from walking on four to walking on two so they could reach stuff on the tree branches. That's the story they've got. I'm sorry, that's a made-up story. That's not science. How about the houses monkeys make? That's an orangutan's house. Here's a human's house. Here's a chimpanzee house. Here is Alabama's largest house. Mr. Nelson, humans are not apes. No ape or any other animal builds houses anything similar to the way humans do. Nothing close, okay? What about using tools? Oh, look at that, he picked up a stick. Whoa, okay. I don't think apes' tools are anything similar to human tools, okay? We have a shop down. How many tools do we have in the shop? Thousands, bunch, okay? No animal comes close to humans in tool use. They might get a stick and shove it down a hole and try to get a few ants to stick to it. If you think that's similar to launching a space shuttle or building a skyscraper, you are absolutely insane. Completely bonkers, okay? Humans are not apes. No ape or any other animal uses tools anything similar to the way humans do. So stop saying humans are apes. No, we're not. Human feet are very different from chimpanzee feet. They did not evolve from a common ancestor. They have a common designer. The feet are very different. The bone structure, the joints, very different. The way that we walk and roll our foot compared to the way an ape does it, none of their feet are similar to ours. If you say, well, look, they've got 5 digits, 4 toes, and we've got four toes and a great toe. Well, this, again, could prove common designer, not common ancestor. Just in case you don't know, okay? This is the human foot over here. This is the ape's foot, okay? The feet are very different on the two. We have a large heel. They have a small heel. We have an ankle adapted for walking. Their ankle is adapted for climbing, the way the bones attach there. Stiff midfoot for propulsion when you push off of your stride. They have a flexible midfoot. Anyway, there's lots of differences in the ape foot and the human foot. I think the fact that there are a few similarities is evidence of a common designer. Same guy designed them and did a wonderful job, by the way. Apes' feet and human feet are very different. You can study the feet very carefully and say, wow, you could imagine that one could evolve to the other, but that's pure imagination. They know the problem with feet when it comes to evolution. So when they found Lucy in 1973, Hadar Valley, Ethiopia, Nathaniel Jeanson found Lucy, became very famous for it. The only thing he ever did in his life of any recognition, I think. But they put human feet on the Lucy display at the St. Louis Zoo. And here's a general biology textbook. How did humans evolve? Hominid evolution. A reconstruction of Lucy on display at the St. Louis Zoo. A female skeleton found more than 20 years ago. Fossilized footprints from the ash. So they're equating Lucy to making these fossilized footprints, which were 100% normal human footprints. Whoa, this is deceit all the way through. Lucy, what nice feet you have. Many of the people, science of biology, different authors said, oh, Lucy had human feet. This is absolutely baloney. Not a single foot bone was found. None. They have to put it in there, though, because this is a major problem to go from a human foot to an ape foot. I'm sorry, Mr. Nelson. Humans are not apes. Their feet show us that very clearly, okay? The human pelvis is very different from chimpanzee pelvis. They did not evolve from a common ancestor. They have a common designer. Our pelvis is designed for walking upright. Theirs is designed for walking on all four. Our pelvis supports the organs inside, it holds them in place because of vertical up and down gravity pulling on them. The pelvis is very different. You could study this for a long time. And I'd like to know how on earth you think it changed from one to the other. From the human to the chimpanzee, or chimpanzee to the human, either way, the pelvis is very different. The way the muscles attach is very different. Just the pelvis shows very clearly, and their backbone, walking upright versus horizontal, shows we are not apes. I'm sorry. Now you said it dogmatically, and like Hovind's an idiot, everybody knows this, humans are apes. No, we're not apes. We're not. Stop saying stuff like that. Humans have a large cranium for the brain. Chimpanzees have a small cranium and a small brain. We have a flat forehead and face. They have a protruding brow and sloping face. We have a protruding nose. They have a broad, flat nose. The differences are immense just on the face of the two. The vertebral column and pelvis is very different because we walk with our head held straight above our body and they walk with their backbone horizontal. The placement of the foramen magnum is very different. Ours is up here where the spinal cord goes through into the brain. Theirs is way back here. How did this evolve slowly over millions of years? How did the foramen magnum change position? And where's the evidence for this? Ours is designed to hold the head straight up and down so your field of vision is perpendicular to your backbone. They walk with their backbone like this, so their head's up and they want to see their field of vision is parallel with their backbone. I'm sorry, Mr. Nelson, humans are not apes. The foramen magnum position shows us this very clearly. But they put them in the textbooks like we're related. They drew lines on paper. There we go, that's proof. They got a line on paper. Lord, we're even related to sponges. Whoa. Take a bath with your great grandpa. Yeah, the sponge, okay. You can believe that if you want, but that's not science.
The question of whether or not we are close genetic cousins of the great apes has bothered people for a long time. The answers to this question are perhaps even more interesting and reveal some of the inner workings behind the scenes that surround this contentious issue. So let me go back to the 1970s first. Even though we didn't have the full human DNA sequence until 2001, and then the chimpanzee sequence in 2005, there was enough indirect data available in the scientific literature back in the 70s to make some initial guesses. And from these initial technologies, which we don't even need to get into, it's an indirect way of getting at how similar we are, there was already this conclusion that there's a good chunk of our DNA that is very close to chimpanzee. Fast forward now to 2001, the human DNA sequence is published, and in the background to all of this is the advance of technology. So one of the earliest ways to sequence DNA, and this is important to understand to know why the scientific community has said different things at different times. If you go from the indirect scientific methods in the 1970s to the direct scientific methods, one of the early techniques for sequencing DNA directly was called Sanger sequencing. You'd have to have some sort of starting point. There's 3 billion letters in our DNA sequence. You'd have to have some point for which you already know the sequence. And you could sort of walk along and discover the next, let's say, 300, 700 letters. And you'd know what those letters are. And then you design you use it as your next starting point. And then you do the next 700 letters. And you can see just how slow and gradual this process of discovering a sequence is if it's 3 billion letters long. So for modern DNA sequencing advance, the scientific community has switched to a different technology. The human DNA sequence in 2001 utilized part of what I just mentioned, this slow walking method. But another technology that's been used is called shotgun sequencing, and as well next generation sequencing. So essentially what this is, you take a DNA sequence, you take a sample of DNA, you somehow bust it up into millions of tiny pieces, and ideally this might be, let's say, 50 letters, 100 letters, 150 letters long, and then you can multitask essentially. You can sequence all of these tiny little fragments in parallel, which dramatically speeds up the process. And then you electronically stitch back together the final sequence. So the early technology, the Sanger sequencing, where you sort of walk along 700 letters at a time, gives you a very clear, unambiguous answer at the end, but it's very slow. The newer technology, the next generation, the shotgun type technology, gives you an answer much more quickly, but it has this inherent ambiguity. Because if there are regions of our DNA that are very similar to one another, it may be hard to electronically separate an error in the sequencing process from a real difference, and it's hard to place exactly where in our sequence it should go if you're doing this basically blindly. Well, here's where the history comes even more to play. So the human DNA sequence is established, 2001. Chimpanzee comes along, and they use a type of shotgun sequencing, not the slow walking method, to get the chimpanzee. And then the question arises, let's say you've taken the chimpanzee DNA, you've busted it up into millions, billions of tiny little pieces that are each 50 to 150 letters long, let's say. How do you stitch the sequence back together? How do you know what it's supposed to look like? Well, the investigators assumed, the evolutionists assumed, humans and chimpanzees had a common ancestor, and therefore they could just use the already established human sequence to stitch chimpanzee back together. So baked into the cake from the start is the idea that we're very similar, and so you can just align them carefully. Now, what's ironic in all of this, and this is what really gave rise to the common claim that we're 99% genetically identical with chimpanzee. Those two studies, 2001 and 2005, and the 2005 one, where they're using human DNA to orient and stitch back together the pieces of the chimpanzee DNA. So what people knew in 2005 is here's a bunch of fragments of chimpanzee DNA, and if we use the human DNA as a template, we can put the puzzle back together in this manner, and it looks like it's 99%. Now, of course, there's a little bit of circular reasoning built into that, because you've essentially assumed human and chimpanzee is very similar from the start. You've used the human as a template, sort of if you're putting a puzzle together. You're using the human DNA sequence as the cover for the box for the puzzle pieces, and you're using that to align on the chimpanzee puzzle pieces and figure out how it goes back together. Despite all of those built-in, somewhat circular assumptions in the methodology, despite all that, there were still chunks of chimpanzee DNA that could not find any match to human. That was typically excluded from the discussion. So that's another step to consider here. Not only was, first of all, the chimpanzee sequence built and stitched together on a human template, and the results of that is what they said was 99% identical, there were still, and this wasn't mentioned as much, fragments of chimpanzee DNA that could not match to human, and vice versa. There are parts of human that did not match chimpanzee. Analyzing those data, and one of my colleagues had done this extensively, analyzing these data, it looked like we were more around the order of 88% identical with chimpanzee. Now, that may not sound like a massive difference, 99% down to 87%. Well, isn't it still really similar? In terms of raw numbers, it's a huge difference. So if we're 88% identical with chimpanzee at the DNA level, 12% different. That means we're 300 to 400 million DNA letters different from the chimpanzee. It's a pretty big gap. Now, all of this has been thrown into more confusion by the latest advance in technology. They've basically gone back to the old way, in a sense, of sort of walking along the DNA, but they've got new tools now. The scientific community has new tools to sequence longer stretches. So instead of having a particular starting point, then discovering the next 700 letters of the sequence, and then picking that where it ends as the new starting point, and on you go, they can now do tens of thousands of letters in one sitting. Then you got a new starting point. Then you do the next tens of thousands of letters, new starting point, and on you go. It's a better way to stitch the genomes, the DNA back together. And that's now been done for chimpanzee, for human, I think for gorilla and orangutan, this newer technology that should allow you more of a bias-free stitching of the human and chimpanzee puzzles back together. However, from my reading of that particular paper that just came out in the last year or two, it seems that the authors punted and didn't even try to answer the question of just how similar, how identical, how different human and chimpanzee DNA is. So to summarize all this up, we've got several histories operating in parallel. We've got the history of DNA sequence discovery technology, which has advanced over time. That's in the background. The human DNA, and then there's the history of the actual human and chimpanzee DNA sequences. Human discovered first. Chimpanzee, using the technology that exists at the time, is broken up into tons of tiny fragments, assembled back together on the human template, but there's still this nagging element of the study that shows there's parts of chimpanzee that are just very different from human. And now there's this latest technology, and people aren't talking as much about just how similar humans and chimpanzees are. So what is the answer at the end of the day? I have a feeling what we'll discover is humans and chimpanzees will still have a very high percentage of their DNA in common. And this shouldn't surprise or intimidate anyone. Long before we had DNA sequencing technology, long before we even had the field of genetics, it was obvious from the anatomical and physiological levels that humans and the great apes, chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, had a lot in common in terms of appearance, basic body structure, that sort of thing. There's still some major differences. For example, you can look at the great apes, the shape of their feet. They have feet that look like hands, used for grasping tree limbs and such, swinging through the trees, whereas humans have feet that are shaped and built for upright walking. So without even knowing what the DNA sequence is, and if you were just looking at our anatomy and physiology and say, well, what would you guess the DNA similarity to be between us and the great apes? You might predict from the outset there to be a high level of similarity because DNA is what encodes during the developmental process the anatomy and physiology that's built. We're similar anatomically and physiologically, therefore we should be similar genetically. It shouldn't surprise anyone. And that does not mean common ancestry. So here's where the rubber really meets the road when we think about what does it mean Really, the bigger question we're trying to answer is, why are humans and great apes similar? It doesn't matter if you look at the anatomy, the physiology, the genetics, they all basically agree that we're pretty close. Exactly how close is still up in the air, but we're still fairly close. What should that imply about where we came from? And this is a question that has been confused by the evolutionary community for over a century. Somehow, I think evolutionists, and maybe even the lay public, has approached this question thinking, okay, if we're made in the image of God, shouldn't we be obviously distinct from the rest of biology? And I'd say in one sense, yes, and in one sense, no. In the sense of no, I don't think the Bible implies that there's a certain pattern that's animal life, and humans should be equally distant from every single animal species out there. There should be no hierarchy. We're more similar to this species than another species. That's not implied by the text. And in fact, I think the text implies the opposite. The Bible doesn't say the patterns in which God created creatures in the beginning, but it does tell us we're made in His image. And so if we look at how humans have made things, created things, designed things, this might give us some inspiration into the patterns in which God may have created things in the beginning. So we naturally design things in groups within groups patterns. So if you were to look at the types of vehicles humans have designed even this year, you will quickly see they naturally form a groups within groups patterns. An automobile has a tremendous amount of similarity to other automobiles. I'm thinking of the American terms now, but an 18-wheeler or a semi-tractor trailer is obviously different from a car, but the car and a semi-tractor trailer are similar enough to each other that it sets them apart from an airplane. And there's this groups within groups patterns that emerges when you look at all the vehicles that humans have designed, and that's just a sort of a serendipitous empirical observation. We just naturally do this. So why wouldn't God do the same thing? Why wouldn't God design kinds of creatures in the beginning that are very different from us and some that are more similar to us? It helps us realize that we're distinct from nature. There's some things that are very different. There's some things that look more similar to us, but they're still not human. One of the things I wanted to do early on when I started professionally in the creation and evolution debate, and started with the Institute for Creation Research, now with Answers in Genesis, was to write a book called Chimps Don't Build Jets. People get preoccupied with the biology of humans and chimpanzees, and they miss the bigger picture. Humans build space shuttles. They go to the moon. They write symphonies. They make all sorts of fancy meals, and chimpanzees don't do any of those things. Mankind has done all these things, and not a single chimpanzee has ever accomplished that, nor will they ever do that on their own, because they're fundamentally distinct from us. So the fact that there's this groups within groups pattern in nature, where we are closer to some species than to others, anatomy-wise, physiologically, genetically, that is actually a hallmark of design, because humans design things in groups within groups patterns. Why shouldn't God do the same thing? And so the fact that there exists this level of similarity that chimpanzees and humans share, that let's say humans and cows do not, that shouldn't bother anyone. This is what you'd expect life to look like if God created the world.
What do you think about the assumed chromosome 2 fusion? Is this evidence that man is related to apes?
But again, that has been disproven decades ago. That is so old, I'm surprised that anybody would even mention it. But the fact of the matter is that we are not genetically related to apes at all. Now, think about it for just a second. Let's run some numbers. Evolutionists would like you to think that as things got bigger, better, faster, smarter, we were adding DNA, accumulating it to get to the bigger, better, faster, smarter, correct? The more complex, more intelligent. Is that right? And yet, there are creatures that have far more genetic information. Apes have 11.5% more DNA than we do, but they certainly are not better than us. And the idea that is so commonly thrown around, oh, I heard it on TV yesterday. This newsman who didn't have a clue what he was talking about said, well, we're only 1 or 2% DNA different from apes. First of all, it was never true. Never true. It's a lie. Flat out lie. It was invented about 1998, 1999 with no evidence to support it whatsoever. However, what happened? As we started to understand the human genetic genome, we started to find out that it has vastly different characteristics to that of apes. So around the year 2000, instead of being 96, 97, 98, 99% the same as, say, chimpanzees, even the evolutionists, without any evidence beyond the fact that they could start telling that there were differences, only published it was 95.2. But what happened was, as they went on to 2005 and on to 2013, and I want to bring you up to date, the more we knew about the genetics of the human, and we knew the entire genome alphabet in 2003, but we didn't know the ape genome, every character, in 2003. So they were comparing incomplete information with complete information. And they were using the human DNA as a template to put the ape DNA in the order they wanted it to make it look like it came from us. But of course, that's not true. The DNA actually is on different chromosomes and so forth. And the concept, apes have an extra set of chromosomes we don't have, and that somehow or another they melded together in the X chromosome. Well, what happens? The more we know, the more the numbers changed. So if you take a look at the publications, for instance, of the national proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, you find out that the numbers were going down as a percentage. And today, we can say the DNA of humans and apes is only 70% the same. Now, let's compare that for just a moment. That's 900 million DNA differences to start with. And even at rates which evolutionists believe material changes beneficially, there wouldn't be enough time to produce a human. And that's using their assumptions. But let's take a look. You don't start at zero when you compare living organisms when it comes to DNA. All living organisms, I don't care whether you're a bacteria, a plant, an animal, or a human being, all organisms that are biological share 25% the same DNA. So you don't start at zero to compare to begin with. I love the fact that you mentioned SpongeBob a little earlier, because I just wanted to break out laughing. And I'll explain why. Let's take a look and compare now the genomes that we do know compared to humans and apes. And I mentioned we now know that we're only 70% the same genetically in the genes with apes, right? But you're 50 to 60% the same as a banana. You're 35% the same as a daffodil or narcissus. It's the same plant. But you are 86% the same as a rat. At least a rat's a mammal, is that correct? But you are 70% the same as a sea sponge. So maybe SpongeBob and we are related.
They tell us that man grunted language into existence. But who are they? Scientists. That's right, not linguists who actually study and specialize in language for a living. So are you going to take some paleontologist, zoologist, or anthropologist theory for human language development from people who know nothing about it nor study it? That's not logical. So before I get into why it's impossible developmentally, neurologically, mathematically, and statistically that language cannot arise on its own, ask yourself, why would man even wait hundreds of thousands of years before using the same skills of today to record history? Speech is a fundamental part of evolution. Even Darwin himself said speech is 95% plus of what lifts man above animals. So no one can say that language has nothing to do with evolution. It most certainly does. And linguistics requires intelligence. Where did that come from? Language as a code only comes from intelligence. What I have noticed from studying stochastic models is that human language could not have arose on its own, and the numbers required for it to have don't come even close to telling the real story. I'm not talking about communication. I am specifically talking about human language. Keep this in mind. Epoch 1 has nothing whatsoever to do with geology, paleontology, or time. It is a period used to denote the transition from a non-language, Epoch 0, to language, Epoch 1. An epoch is a period that represents a state. Epoch 0 has no grammar, and therefore no language. Epoch 1 is the first use of grammar, and accordingly the use of first language. The period between Epoch 0 and 1 is not a day, a week, or a year. It is any period of time. It is the gradations which require for the transition between the states. That is why it's called an epoch and not a year. After reviewing all possible stochastic models associated with the age of complexity restraints of human language acquisition, it is clear that there were not enough people and that human mental development could never have allowed humans to invent language. These models are what helped me determine this information to be a fact that no evolutionary theory nor debate can get around. I will get into more detail, but for now I think the first important lesson is on the Markov process. It's far more important to help you understand how this process can be used to show transitions between states from no language to language, which are epochs. Now, draw two circles side by side. In the left bubble, put the letter A. In the right bubble, put the letter B. Your bubbles represent states, state A and B. If we further define these states, we can say that state A represents an epoch of no language and state B represents an epoch of language. We begin with our entire population of the world in bubble A. They can only move to bubble B if they can pass the burdens associated with the age of complexity constraints, which are based on more than 250 years of medical, psychiatric, and linguistic observations. At epoch 0, there aren't enough people in bubble A to overcome the burdens that move people to bubble B, and this number is not even remotely close. There are a lot of definitions in math associated with the full explanation, which I will elaborate a little bit on. But I do not want this to be boring or get lost on you. So, in a nutshell, it is a population problem where language cannot arise on its own. There weren't enough people at epoch 0 to overcome the burden of the constraints, and the people don't get to graduate to bubble B for free. They would have to overcome and pass the constraints. If there weren't enough people to overcome the burden at epoch 0, then language is not a byproduct of nature. If language is not a byproduct of nature, then language came from somewhere else. If language came from somewhere else, then evolution is false. And because it only takes one piece of evidence to falsify the theory of evolution, I have done just that with this irrefutable evidence. I guess the next best way for me to describe this model is by looking at the multiple cases of feral children, or totally neglected, isolated children as well. Specifically, I want to look at Jeannie Weil's case, because I find this one the most interesting. Using Dr. Eric Lindbergh's and Professor Suzanne Cutress's work regarding the age of complexity restraints of language acquisition, and then applying the data to a small world population, hint, all world populations were considered small until agriculture began, then it forms an infinite no-language loop, from parent to child over and over and over again. There are no natural exits for this loop. Studies have found once a human is in the loop, they are trapped. There aren't enough people to overcome the statistical burdens. It's not even remotely close, even in a large-scale population. If it wasn't even in the ballpark, then I would give it a consideration. But it isn't, and that means there is no natural path to language acquisition. One would need a population size that is sufficient to meet the burdens that are imposed on the population. Language came from somewhere else, and it seems nature had nothing to do with it. You see, you were raised normally, which means that you were provided with language stimuli, and you met the standards for language fluency before you turned 5 years old. The defining difference between language acquisition L1 and the second language acquisition L2 is that the age of the person learning the language. For example, linguist Eric Lindbergh used second language to mean a language consciously acquired or used by its speaker after puberty. Language is only learned for L2. L1 is not learned, it is acquired. And there is a huge difference between learning a language and acquiring a language. Jeannie was a prime example of that difference. We are not talking about communication again, we're talking about language. You can use your L1 for the rest of your life to learn new abstract concepts, or for graduations to learn new language, L2. That is not the challenge. Before there was language, there was no language. The challenge was not to get primitive man to use L1, or new abstract words. Primitive man was like Jeannie, no language at all. She had no L1, nor did primitive man. Dr. Eric's challenge would have been to create grammar, because none existed. You can't compare primitive man challenges to your ability to use your L1 to learn new abstract things. I have noticed that from all the research that abstract words cannot be learned after puberty because abstract concepts cannot be understood or learned. That information I have gathered comes from the work of Dr. Lindbergh and his book Biological Foundations of Language, and more than 250 years of medical observations into all these studies have proven what I'm talking to you about. Let's say today you wanted to prove that human language can evolve and that it can form from nothing. What you would have to do is take every human being in the world and put them together. Now take everybody over the age of 13 and remove them. Now you're left with the people that have the ability to learn human language, because anybody after that age cannot grasp and learn the abstract concepts to learn language. So wolves do not have a language. They have primitive communication skills. Fish do not have language. They also have primitive communication skills. No professional linguist would say that wolves or fish have a language. To classify as a language, grammar must be present. Wolves and dolphins, for example, have no grammar. Even my friend's bird, who can pronounce words, again has no language. Only humans have grammar. So we know fish, birds, primates, and wolves can't talk about yesterday or tomorrow or the past activities or future activities. They can only make sounds about current activities or base nouns. Only human children possess the ability to learn grammar for L1. Adults can then take their knowledge of L1 and use translations to learn L2. But no language-deprived adult can ever learn grammar without L1. If a person has been deprived of language from the age of 13 years of life, then it's over. Another study has found that anatomically speaking, macaques are perfectly well equipped for human-like speech, even compared with a human. When stimulated, monkey voices sound flat and gravelly, but the words are clear and comprehensible. Then why can't they speak? Because their brains are not the same as ours. We were created different and in the image of God, and God taught Adam. And all of the observational research that exists just helps prove this point. This is a fact. Since observations and study began in 1644, not a single case of a child over the age of 13 has ever been able to learn language. And that is not based on some creationism or religious belief. This is all based off medical observation over the past 250 plus years, based on all accepted criteria for falsifying evolution theory by professional scientists. This problem beats that criteria, because for evolution to be true, there had to be a natural path to everything that all species possess. Knowing all of this, imagine now the idea that propagates today, that all humans unconnected worldwide all managed to form language independently and roughly all at the same time without knowledge from one another. As is obvious now, that theory is obsolete.
The only way Aron Ra here, and any other evolutionist for that matter, can still say that humans are apes is to ignore 99.5% of the current data field. For example, the fact that they say humans and chimpanzees have genetic identity that's approximately 98 to 99% similarity. The fact of the matter is that the actual identity is only about 88% similar. And you might think to yourself, well, that's still slightly similar, but the thing is, that is over 400 million DNA differences that actually exist between the two species, because when they figure out that number, that is based on preferential and selective treatment of data. That's why when you don't just use cherry-pick data, for example, sequences that they expect to be similar based on their bias, their evolutionary bias, that's how you come to the 88% similarity, which destroys ape-to-man evolution. And to not go too deep into it, what they don't include is non-aligned DNA gaps, copy number variations, and size differences. The reality is the fact that humans are not apes, and they were created separately and uniquely in the image of God, just as the Bible records. The Y chromosome, for example. The Y chromosome disproves ape to man human evolution, because the significantly different DNA sequence of the Y chromosomes is remarkable and extensive. This is a serious problem for common ancestry because given the low level of recombination and DNA sequence diversity on this Y chromosome, the human evolution paradigm is faced with a fatal blow and serious problem because the human and chimp Y chromosomes should be a lot more similar to each other if human evolution was actually true. They should be the most similar chromosomes in the genome because they are so stable. For example, small amount of variation. But the fact is the Y chromosome is remarkably different between the humans and the chimps. It's approximately 70%. This is a fatal blow. We can look at orphan genes. Orphan genes are fully functional gene sequences that code for both a functional messenger RNA and a protein. And they lack similar counterparts in other organisms. Now, orphan genes that are specific to humans are very convincing evidence against the idea that we evolved from apes. Aron Ra says that we're still apes, but as you can see, genetics proves biblical creation and disproves ape to man evolution. Now, these orphan genes, the reason why these orphan genes are very powerful evidence against this idea that Aron Ra puts forth is because these genes appear fully formed and uniquely integrated into the complexity of the human genomic network and clearly functional and important to various cellular processes. There is absolutely no evidence. This is just icing on the cake, given everything that has already been talked about. But there's no evidence for common ancestry with apes or any other creatures. This amazing category of genes, these orphan genes, are taxonomically restricted genes that are unique to each type of organisms. And these genes appear suddenly without any trace of ancestry in apes or any other animal. And Aron Ra can look to a hypothetical SpongeBob La La Land imagination fairy tale, but they don't fit that hypothetical fairy tale. These orphan genes are evidently part of the genomic landscape and is indicative of each created kind. It fits the biblical model of created kinds. This type of category of genes, they're needed for the uniqueness associated with each created kind, as we can read in the book of Genesis. They will also say, given Aron Ra's list of evidence here, showing that, quote unquote, humans are apes, is that humans are genetically closer to apes. He'll look to nested hierarchies, because a human is genetically closer to a chimpanzee than a human is to, say, a dog, or a whale, or a banana plant. That nested hierarchical classification system that we see in life. And they'll say that that irrefutably demonstrates common ancestry. But the fact is, these relative hierarchies are characteristics of design. If you look at molecular evidence, as Aron Ra points to here, he'll say human chromosome 2 arose through a fusion of two ape-like ancestors. But the alleged site where the fusion supposedly theoretically has taken place actually represents a highly organized functional gene, and there is a significant lack of evidence for a cryptic centromere site. Therefore, that purported fusion site, it's actually a functional DNA element in a human gene. Once again, genetics proves that man is created separately from apes and any other animal. They'll also say, we've all heard it, Aron Ra says humans and chimpanzees share genetic mistakes. How do you explain this? Pseudogenes, for example. But pseudogenes are now known, based on further scientific discovery, to be functional DNA elements and not mistakes. The junk DNA era, the junk DNA paradigm has been completely overturned. We have only just begun to discover just how amazingly functional the human genome is, and it's mind-boggling. It's flabbergasting how many experiments would be required to actually conclude with any level of confidence that a particular set of DNA sequences has absolutely no function. For example, when they look to molecular phylogenetics, molecular data to prove their ape to man ancestry, they'll say gene order along chromosomes has no function. And they conclude that shared gene order demonstrates common ancestry, but the gene order along chromosomes has very important functional roles. Like I said, all this evidence points to biblical creation. And preliminary biochemical evidence for function doesn't just exist for the known functional pseudogenes, but also for at least 80% of all the pseudogenes in humans. And given this known data, it's obvious and evident to anybody with common sense who's not anti-science that the other 20% may still yet to be found to be functional in some human tissue or even under some physiological condition that has not yet been studied thoroughly. For example, many non-coding RNA genes, such as these pseudogenes, are only expressed under certain conditions. Shared endogenous retroviruses, ERVs that Aron Ra will point to. It's one failure after another. These ERVs play important functional roles as well. They're important DNA elements, not mistakes. They don't prove universal common ancestry. Those pseudogenes, those so-called fossil sequences, they're not pseudo after all. As I've stated many times in debates and discussions with some of the top evolutionary proponents and defenders, these genes are necessary and required to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. Aron Ra's so-called ape to man ancestry, the fairy tale that he wants to hope, dream, and imagine is true, is dead. They've looked at beta globin pseudogene, the supposed broken remnants of an ancient chicken gene. They're now known to be functional DNA elements, all contrary to what evolutionists would have you believe. The GULO pseudogene, for example, the evolutionists use a very small amount of highly selective data. It's all preferential and selective treatment of data, and it only represents a very minute piece of the entire GULO gene regions, and patterns of the GULO gene atrophy in the various types of animals in which they occur, taxonomically restricted in their genomic signatures and lack evidence of common ancestry. The data is actually significantly consistent with the notion that they are independent events. It's based on cherry-picked data. And if it occurred millions of years ago, this GULO pseudogene, the exons would be much more degraded. The GULO pseudogene that Aron Ra would look to is obvious and very strong evidence for genetic discontinuity between humans and apes, not the inheritance of shared mistakes. This is all consistent with genetic entropy and systematic discontinuity, not ape to man evolution that he'll have you believe. At the end of the day, we are devolving and not evolving. Mutations are not construction. They're not the creator. We are accumulating mutations per generation. Humans, for example, 100 new mutations per person per generation, and these near neutral, low impact deleterious mutations, they're unselectable. They build up in the genome. We are degrading. These so-called human ape ancestors that they can look to, it's all evidence of a biblical creation model. For example, the hobbits that they look to, the early human population, what we now know is that they were inbred and apparently suffered from a special type of genetic degeneration called reductive evolution, which results in reduced body size, reduced brain volume, and various pathologies. These bones found in the dirt that they'll look to, it's more consistent with a biblical creation model of post-flood, post-Babel isolation, inbred effects, for example. Even the early human population referred to as the Neanderthal, there's a paper that describes them as highly inbred, had a very high genetic load. This severe genetic degeneration, probably post-Babel and due to inbreeding and isolation, contributed to the disappearance of this human population. Homo erectus, for example, seems to have suffered from reductive evolution. They were inbred. The genetic degeneration of erectus was less advanced, of course, which indicates the more moderate reductions in body size, brain size, and other pathologies. But many paleoanthropologists would fold both Hobbit and Naledi, for example, into the more diverse erectus category. This is all we see. Genetic degeneration, the fact that we're going down since the fall. There's no evidence for ape to man ancestry. It's about time these evolutionists quit denying the science.